What I'm going to show you here is the conclusion of, I think, almost 10 years of work. Because when Ida graduated the university and started in CoffeeMind, the first thing she did was to start to work with the creators group of the certification system. And this is Ida, just if you didn't know. I'm speaking on her behalf. And then in the education system, there was something about teaching, training, and testing people in individual organic acid identification. And she was just, it's funny, I've got a master's degree in sensory science and I've never heard about this before. What's going on? Isn't this correct, Ida? And then she kind of started to ask the creators group, where's this from? And they sent her some material and she read the science, and there was it wasn't really answering that question. So none of the research in acids really suggested or supported the idea that you can even taste the individual organic acids in brewed coffee. There's a lot, you can find things about acids in coffee, but there's no reason to know a lot about the chemical composition of anything if you don't have a sensory correlate to what does it even mean, what kind of concentrations do you need, and what's the sensory relevance of chemistry, because you can have a lot of chemistry that's just not sensory relevant if it's below sensory threshold. So we've been going through this for 10 years, and I'm going to basically show you what it means to have evidence, to investigate evidence in an area. Because that's one of the things, and this connects back to the latest podcast episode on something called evidence hierarchies, which is a nice and easy word that everybody knows already. But it's a concept in theory of science and research design that gives you a picture. What does it mean to have a qualified insight into a subject area? And basically it just means that we need a few publications from different universities and different people that find similar findings than the other people found. That's the only thing it says, or that's the meaning. So those of you who have heard that podcast episode, this is a specific example of what it looks like to have evidence or not in an area. So this is a more specific walkthrough of the more theoretical problems I discussed in the podcast episode. So this is the scientific article that was published in March 24. So 1.5 years ago. And yeah, we haven't really had we had a few angry people on our Instagram, but that's the feedback we've gotten. And I suggested to present this last year at World of Coffee in Milan, and that wasn't taken. So nobody is talking about it except us still. So that's why I really wanted to give you a detailed insight into the evidence trail behind this. So first of all, I'll explain you something about research design and scientific investigation. This is crucial to understand what science is and what the dynamics is between investigating something, finding a conclusion, and then kind of going through that iterative step of becoming more and more wise in the subject that you're looking for. And the point is that it seems like the community the last 50 years has been more busy creating new stuff than going through all the stuff we already do and see what actually doesn't make sense. And that's really frustrating because there's a lot of things that doesn't make sense, and which is a waste of people's time if we are not taking it away from the curriculum. And this is a perfect example of something that has, in our mind, survived for too long. It's 2 decades now. It's running in the SCA system and the Q system. So we need to look into this, not to waste people's time. And so the idea of testing hypothesis goes all the way back to 1933. This was the paper published by Neumann that really fleshed out this way of thinking that we need to have more of in the specialty coffee community to weed out nonsense. So I'm just saying that this almost 100 years ago, and I'm saying this because let's not invent new stuff all the time. Let's stand on the shoulders of the giants, which is the way of thinking that was established in different scientific areas, such as this on the problem of the most efficient test of statistical hypothesis. So this is the way of thinking of statistics. And then in the other presentation, I said, why do we invent new century methodologies when there are already some giants we can stand on the shoulders on and kind of just not have to invent something new? So science is investigating the world. So we are trying to get an insight into nature where we are absolutely, or we feel as sure as possible about what's the case and what's not the case. And the funny thing is that you can believe something is the case, or you can believe something is not the case. For example, you can believe it makes sense to investigate organic acids, or you can believe it's not the case. That's your belief. But the confusing aspect of this is you can actually be right or wrong about both things, right? So you can think it is the case, and it can be true, in which case you are right. And you can also believe that it's not true, and it is in reality it isn't, in which case you are also drawing the right conclusion. But the problem is, you can think it's the case, but actually it isn't. And you can also think it's not the case, but it is. And this goes back to this article that I told you about. This is named a type 2 error, and this is named a type 1 error, and this is named a type 2 error. And the brilliance of this article is, well, they found a way to calculate whether you can actually calculate if this is the case or not. This is statistics, you're gathering some data, and then you can test whether you believe this is the case or not. And the short version is, and this is what's called the H0 hypothesis in statistics, you assume that it's not the case. So what's the probability of seeing the differences you see if the differences are just a coincidence? You know this from triangulation copying, that you can actually, things can be a coincidence. So if you hit a dice, you would expect to get one of each of the outcomes, approximately 1/6 of the time. So in a sense, you can say either you believe that the dice is broken, or you believe it's not broken. How will you test that? Well, you will keep hitting. And then the question is, does this look like a random outcome where I believe here I believe it works, but if you have some data, let's say you just hit 6 times, and you get 1 twice, is it broken? Why? Because you can still get it with a probability that's not. But if you are hitting it 10,000 times, and you can see you're much more likely to get 1 than any of the others. Let's say half of them is 1 and the rest is the others. Then it's broken, right? So this H0 hypothesis is asking if you have a completely, it works if you have a completely even outcome with all the dices. But if it's skewed, if it's half of them is ones and the rest is the rest, then it's just too improbable. Because you have to admit, if you hit it 10,000 times, there's still a probability that it's a random outcome. Do you see? There's actually still a possibility that it's not broken. Can you see that as a hypothesis, it could still be just a coincidence that half of them was ones, because there's a probability for that outcome. It's just such a low probability that you don't believe it. And that's the p-value you see in all statistics. That is the probability of the random outcome given that there's really no difference. And if that probability is small enough, you dare to trust the other hypothesis, which is it is actually not broken. Do you see that? You can actually given the data you have, you can calculate the probability of the outcome. And if the probability of the outcome is so small that you don't believe it, you have to trust that it's true. So that's the whole idea with this. And you can also, the other question is, so here you can make the error. If you think there's a difference, but really there isn't, you make a type 1 error. But you can also think that there is no difference, but really there is. And then you're doing a type 2 error. So if you look for your keys, they can either be lost or you just didn't find them. So you need to in your statistics, you need to show that you was searching for long enough. And that's the problem with our data with the assets. We need to prove that the power of the study, this is called the power of the study, was big enough so that if we didn't find something, it was because it wasn't there. Because that's the danger that if we conclude it doesn't make sense, this is our risk. We are risking a type 2 error. So you can see there's type 1 error and that type 2 error. And I've got some examples to make it a bit more easy to understand. So everybody had COVID, I guess. So you can see, you can have a test, a positive test, or you can have a negative test. But the problem was that you could be right or wrong with both. So if you had a positive test, but really you didn't have COVID, it was a false positive. These exist, right? But you could also have a false negative because your test was negative, but really you had it. So you can see the problem is you're never really sure. So you need to calculate the probability. And this is why it's a bit confusing that you have an outcome space of 4, because you can be right or wrong about both your assumptions. And this is the situation we are in. We can never be completely sure about any of these, but we can calculate the probability of being wrong about them. And if those probabilities are small enough, we trust the opposite. So that's how science works. And this is why we need a lot of individual studies. And I just try to come up with a lot of situations. If you've had kids, you know that sometimes you need to change the nappy. But sometimes it smells like there's something there. And there's something you need to change it. But there's also sometimes a false positive, right? If you check and there was nothing, okay. Or you can say that it's a false negative. There is something, but you never smelled it, right? So you can have your kid running around and then you actually missed it. And that's also a problem. So you can see how this is permeating in legal judgment. You can think the person is guilty, or you can think the person is not guilty. And we spend a lot of time. Why don't we just ask the person, did you do it? Right? It should be that simple, but it isn't. So sometimes we punish somebody who shouldn't have been because we thought they were guilty, but they weren't, even though we spent a lot of time figuring out. And sometimes people go free even though they did it. So you can see also ghosts. You can think they exist, or you can believe they don't. And if they do, it's correct. But if they don't, you're superstitious. If you think they don't exist, you're right if they don't. But if they do, you're close-minded. So can you see how this permeates everything if you think something is the case or not? And then security airport, false alarm, that's a type 2 error. If you miss a dangerous item, that's a type 1 error, and miss a dangerous good is type 2 error. Spam detection, type 1 error if non-spam goes in your filter, and as a type 2 error is if your spam goes in the inbox. And burglary alarm and marriage, you can be jealous, right? Or somebody can have an affair without you knowing it. So you can see this is actually a really nice and simple model that really works. And it's funny because I was thinking when I did my master's thesis, I did it on meditation and deep neurological implications. So I did, and that in the zeros, this was everybody at the university was just no. That's just something people imagine themselves. That's not a deep thing. But I would say that since I worked on this 20 years ago, it was a type 2 error. And I knew because I had done a lot of meditation at that point, and I just knew that it was a huge thing for emotions regulation and cognitive regulation. But that's not something people work with at neither the medical department or philosophy. So I had to struggle with type 2 errors during my master's thesis. And now that I'm out of the university, I'm struggling with type 1 errors because people see ghosts everywhere. So it's funny that I have a career where I'm kind of fighting from opposite corners. Yeah, so CoffeeMind, we are really, so you can see we have identified these errors with quality in the cupping form that I talked about earlier, and also the organic acid and the rate of rise. So for us, we think this is unicorn land. And if you think it exists when it doesn't, you are doing a type 1 error. So, and we think that it shouldn't be believed, even though it is believed. So you can see how we feel that the education system as such is filled with type 1 errors. And the good thing is, since 1933, there has been methods to systematically investigate this. So we don't need to invent something new to look into this. That's great news, right? We've got the methods already. So you can see here the role of scientific dialogue in a scientific community is walk the narrow path of non-biased truth. So the scientific community, some people get some hypothesis and think, no, we think it's not the case, but really it is the case. So we need to get this over here. And then some people are skeptical, no, that's not the case, so we need to get it over here. So science wants us to get rid of these biases of type 1 and 2 error. That's the whole point of science. So what we also see is you've kind of got it in the reality, you've got body, mind, spirit. So you can see you've got the physical, the legal, or the values and the religious. Types of laws, you've got scientific, social, and ethical. And the consequences of violating the physical world is that it doesn't work, right? You can walk out in front of a car and say you don't believe in being hit by a car and see what happens, right? That's kind of what happens here. Or if you don't respect the laws of physics, you can't land, you cannot have a political discussion that will end in a successful sending a rocket to the moon. You can't come up with laws, right? You have to, here the physical world is telling you what's possible or not. But in your mind, right, this is where you can start to, this is like politics, right? You can think you can have opinions. So you've got the legal system where you can be prosecuted, and then you've got the moral systems where you can be punished. Sometimes it's not even illegal what you did, but it's not it's not something that the society endorses. So even though you're not punished, it will have moral consequences. You can't get jobs. Also, there are ethical guidelines for research. If you're doing something unethical, like human experiments in a country where it's not illegal, it's typically not published. So it's not, you didn't do anything illegal, but there are moral guidelines for publications that, so my point is that often people talking about this kind of rate of rise or organic acids or quality, they try to speak this language, but based on opinion. So they're trying to dig into science, even though they don't think that they think that if they just believe it strong enough, this is the case, right? Such as what I mentioned, rate of rise, organic acids, or quality. But the point is we have ways that we can test this. So sometimes you talk with people, it's like talking science with somebody where it feels like they feel they are talking politics, where we are trying to talk science. So people are confusing these levels of reality. So what this is really about is the organic acids in coffee. So you've got chlorogenic acids, and then you've got these acids that are already in green, malic, tartaric, and citric. They are already in the green coffee. And then you've got the acids that are when glucose is broken down. You've got these smaller formic, acetic, glycolic, and lactic. And so when we looked into this, Christina, who was the main author of this, she's really a good detective when it comes to research. She's done some review articles earlier. So she just trawled the scientific papers from 1959 to 2020. Everything that has been about organic acids in green, roasted, and brewed. Only 4 of them reported first-hand data on organic acids. These 4. And none of them really did anything about that showed that it was relevant to look into individual organic acids. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at the relevance of this. So the first thing you need to look at, and this is also already what Ida discussed, because she said she passed the Q grader by knowing that they put, is it 0.4 grams per liter per acid. But if you know anything about organic acids, you know that they don't have the same, they are not equally acidic. Because if you look at these acids, you can see it's the carboxylic part of the acid, and a carboxylic part is a C bound to a double O, and a single O with a single bond to an H. That's a carboxylic group. And the point is, this H is likely to fall off in liquid. So pH is the concentration of these, pH is the concentration of the free hydrogen atoms in the liquid. That's acidity. And you can see, okay, malic acid has got 2, tartaric has got 2, citric has got 3, and the others has got 1 each. So you cannot just add the same amount. And that's one thing, how many you have. There's also different likelihood of these falling off because it depends on the overall structure of the molecules. So these are not evenly likely to fall off, which means you will not have the same perceived acidity. You will not have the same pH of amount of free hydrogens in the liquid if you just add the same amount, which means they will be different perceived intensity of acidities, and that was the trick Ida used to pass. But then it's just a concentration test. Then it's not, malic acid is appley. No, it's just the different acids has got different intensities of acidities because they are not equally acidic. So the first thing you need to know is what is the sensory threshold? What's the sensory threshold of each acid? And then we need to make sure that each individual acid is put only to the amount that makes it equally acidic from a sensory perspective compared to the others. That work isn't done yet. That work should have been done before it was released in exam. Otherwise, you just end up with different intensities and not different flavor types. So the first step would be to do a sensory detection threshold to find out what's the threshold for each acid. And here we use some consumers, and some people would say it's a weakness. I suggested it was a weakness with the study that we are using consumers, but they are consumers because it was primarily students at the University of Southern Denmark. And then Davide, the supervisor of the project, he said, but that's not a problem because if you think about thresholds are the sensitivity threshold for consumers and experts are pretty similar. And that's because just detecting threshold is something that is more related to your physiology than your attention. So you can think about if you can just hear a sound, right? If there's a sound that's below your threshold and you increase the intensity, all of a sudden, now I can hear it. But you would have to, it would need to be a bit higher than the threshold before you can identify if it's a violin or a cello. So a non-musician, if it's sound, would be able to hear, oh, there's a sound, but the musician would be more likely to guess which instruments it is if the sound is just a bit higher than the threshold. Does that make sense? So the expert skills comes in when the sound is quite a bit above the threshold. So it seems like consumers and experts have the same thresholds, but once it's above the threshold, the expert will be more likely to guess the instrument or guess the acid. If it's so the threshold is not the interesting difference between consumers and experts. It's when it's above. So that's why it was safe to just use consumers to do sensory threshold detection. And then there was the recognition test. And in the recognition test, we kind of who to use, right? First of all, some people would say you should find Q graders where we know a bit about the exam. It's not necessarily because we believe that just because you've been running a marathon for 4 days with 20 different subjects that you learn a lot. You can pass it, but it's not that you EDAS programs were weeks and weeks, right? And only after a lot of weeks we saw a small tendency in improvement. So it's not that you can just attend a course in 4 days that's just ridiculously intense and then you come out very skilled. So for us, it wasn't a guarantee to find a Q grader. So we thought, okay, what can we do? And it's also a recruitment problem, of course. So we reached out to Coffee Collective, and if you look a bit in their history of how they work, they have an internal program of education they've done themselves. They actually, I don't think they do it anymore, but when we ask them, they do train organic acids in their internal program. And they've participated, I don't remember, 20 competitions and really done well. So they are very, very skilled people as an organization because they have an internal training program. So we took 13 of their bar managers, people who have been in the organization for many years, well-trained, probably also been competing. So we just knew for ourselves, these are really skilled people. If it's not relevant for them, we don't think it's relevant generally. But of course, it's a weakness of our study. But then again, please show us other data, right? This is pretty good data. 13 people from Coffee Collective, the bar managers. That's not random people. They have skills, right? So just show us other data. But this is then what we found. Yeah, so in water, acetic acid, you could pick up, but that's logical because small acids are volatile. It's a small acid, so it's volatile, which means that it goes into retronationally into your nose and gives you a sensation. But glycolic, just because it's got 1 O more, they are pretty heavy. It's not that volatile, and these are not volatile at all. They will not evaporate. So. Acetic acid was the only one they could pick up when it was in clear water, but also, as Ida says, when it's mixed in coffee, people were just completely thrown. The amount of acid we added to the coffees, they were spiked with the same concentration that they already had. So we measured the concentration of acids in the coffees and then we doubled it. Because we couldn't add the same amount because that wouldn't be fair for the coffees, but we just wanted to, if we double the acidity, it must be relevant because that's much more than we found in any of the coffee. So it's much more that you will find naturally. And even if we did that, people couldn't taste anything. So what about the literature? So in So Christina looked for all the research already existing, and I know you have already also done that, Ida, but for the article, she was just spent extra time trawling everything. And then it was interesting because in 2021, I don't have it here. Yeah, it's 2021. UC Davis, a really well-respected, or actually the most well-respected university in the world, I think, with sensory, because that's where Rosemary Pangborn came up with her idea 50 years ago. They really do sensory work at the highest level. They came out with a meta-analysis, which was great. So we'd been working on this for many years, right? When it was 2021, so we thought, finally somebody looks into this, right? But the interesting thing is that, if you look at the conclusion, one overarching conclusion is that relatively little research has been performed on organic acids in coffee, despite their important role in sensory quality. Where do they have this from? I mean, we haven't been able to find anything, so why do they say that we know that it's important if there's no evidence that backs it up? Data for the less abundant acids in coffee, such as lactic, formic, and tartaric, was notable sparse. So you can see that there's not a lot done on those at all. So we need to understand their role in appreciation, consumer appreciation of coffee. But that's also assuming that they are relevant. Why would they assume they are relevant? Because what they found, a meta-analysis, is an analysis that takes all the research ever done in the area and try to make a statistical model that contains all the information from all the articles. And it turned out that they only had research looking into green and roasted coffee, not brewed. But that's not the fault of the meta-analysis, because they just collect the data that's already there. So the conclusion is that the research done on acids in coffee is done on green and roasted, not brewed. So why would we assume that it's important? Why would we assume that it's relevant for consumers if it's not even studied yet? And if our study came out a few years later that showed that it seems like this is a type 1 error thinking. They don't have any evidence. So it's a type 1 error if you don't have any evidence that backs up your claim. They think it's the case, but according to our data, it's not the case. That's a type 1 error. So this is an overview that Ida made, where basically, because that was another question she had, she was teaching the SCAE, where citric, malic, tartaric, and lactic was used. The Q grader focused on citric, malic, phosphoric, and acetic. And on the SCA flavor wheel, there's citric, malic, acidic, butyric, and isovaleric. Why? Why are they there? So there's no evidence to back it up. Yeah, that's just some conclusions from our previous work. That was actually, because this is my point, right, with the evidence hierarchy. First, we did a pilot study. Before we did the final research article, we did a pilot study. And the pilot study was a student who did both chemical analysis and sensory analysis. And according to her data, there's no evidence. No, that's Ida talking. And yeah, so that's just our point, right? She's skeptical. And then in the findings, there was a weak tendency of the assessors to be able to differentiate citric malic, citric tartaric, and phosphoric citric. But only acetic acid is the only acid where all the results show that assessors have a significant ability to differentiate. And that's because it's volatile. That's also what we saw in the later data. But this was the first data we saw. Yeah, so when acetic acid is present as single acid, the assessors were able to identify this acid as the only acid. But after mixing it with just one other acid, the assessors were not able to identify it anymore. Not in coffee, just mixing with, if you had two acids, they couldn't detect it. So that indicates that it will be very difficult to recognize them in coffee. So this is what we found. and that's also very aligned. Citric acid is the dominant acid. And then you can see we also did some roasting, and we found out that citric acid is going down with roast degree, and the others are created. That's also aligned with the literature. And we even did it with development time. So we could see that this is the pH, so you can see when it goes up, it means that the acidity is less. So you can see even keeping the color the same, that was the roast person in us that also had another student looking into this. So even with development time changes, we saw change in the acidity, and we can just see that the acidity goes down. So pH going up means acidity goes down. And we could see that for a lot of other acids, that we could just see all acids are just going down. So there's no kind of fingerprint of acidity based on roasting development time either. So, but my problem with Christina's, not Christina's, but the pilot study was that we could see, I thought that she made a label error, because we could see that the Brazilian coffee had much more acidity than the Kenyan, and that didn't make sense, because Kenyan are the king of acids, and Brazilian pulp natural is what you add to a blend if you don't want acidity. So we just, she did a label error, so we didn't believe we could use it. And then I talked to Samus Merke from Zurich, and he said he'd seen similar data. And I thought perhaps it wasn't a label error. So we had another university. So that was where, when Christina and Davide from, because these data were done at University of Copenhagen. So Davide and Christina were at SDU, Southern University of Denmark. And then we did these data together. And the funny thing is that we got the same, and this is what Ida mentioned in the previous presentation. The funny thing is that you can see the Kenya or the Brazilian coffees has got double the amount of citric acid as the Kenya. So we found. So can you see how getting the same data twice from different universities support that the first article didn't make a mistake? And that's the idea with the evidence hierarchy, that we need a lot of data to show this, right? So it's not a coincidence what you do. So that's one of the things, but you can also see the sensory thresholds, because those are important, right? The acids needs to be not only at, but quite a bit higher than the sensory threshold to be detectable. Most of them are at or below the threshold. Only citric acid is a lot higher, but for some reason the perceived acidity and the concentration of acid are opposite. So it just doesn't make sense at all. Yeah, so this was, and Ida also showed that in the previous presentation. You can see only citric is way above the threshold. This is the detection threshold. And only phosphoric is, but this you can't hear if this is a violin or a cello, right? It needs to be higher. So this is just at the, so it seems like only the citric is relevant. And again, when people then in coffee, with the spiked acidity being doubled, the amount of the actual acidity, only acetic acid was detected in pure water. So you need to have frequencies of detection higher than this to be above the p-value of 5%. So you remember the dices, right? So as long as it's below here, it's just a random outcome. It's not different from random. Only if the frequency is above the black line, we trust that it's a non-random decision. So only in pure water, the panel took non-random decisions, where we should then believe that they could taste the difference between or identify the organic acid of acidity in pure water. But if you add coffee, they just take random decisions, and you can see they are not even close, right? So if Coffee Collective's 13 bar managers are not even close, I don't know. think we might be able to find some super tasters, but that might not even be in the coffee industry. It's just very unlikely that this is relevant. But notice how I'm saying unlikely, right? Because it's always, you're never sure about anything, but you have evidence, strong evidence that the only sane conclusion from this is that, well, believing that it makes a difference is a type 1 error. All the evidence points to that, so let's just not hope that we can kind of just sound like we are certain enough, because the evidence shows the contrary. So the conclusion is that the concentration of individual acids systematically varies with the roast degree for all acids. So you can see the acids really react on roasting. Only citric acid varies systematically with origin. Recognizing the geographical origin of coffee based on organic acid content is not supported or understood from a chemical perspective. And only citric acid can clearly be detected in concentrations above average measured concentrations. And none of the 5 acids were significantly identified in coffee by coffee experts. So this is to show you that we are not just saying something. We've actually been deep in the literature for 10 years, not found anything because it doesn't exist, like the UC Davis meta-analysis also didn't find anything in brewed coffee, and we kind of brew coffee, right? So that it has to be relevant in brewed coffee. So this is kind of the journey that we've been through to get clear on the questions that Ida started out asking. Why are we doing this? And it seems like on the second decade in the millennia, the evidence shows this, but the education systems are, to our knowledge, still they don't care that there are type 1 errors in their curricula. So can you see also how in the beginning, putting in the frame of type 1 and 2 errors is a bit comforting, because we are on solid ground with research design. This is the way things are questioned, right? We are just doing what science is supposed to do when science is done correctly. And we think that this should be brought to the community as soon as possible. In 2018, I think Ida was at the Roasters Guild Summit at UC Davis in California, where she brought the acids, showed that the audience couldn't taste the difference. Yeah. So it seems like people are more busy doing more overcomplicated stuff than helping us weeding out all the type 1 errors in the education community, which is a bit annoying. So I suggested to present this last year when it was freshly published. It wasn't taken. So that's why I thought this year we'll just make our own presentation series. So, okay, but thank you for showing up. And any other questions or comments for this?